Revelation 3349. From the 27th and the 28th of November 1944. No knowledge, thus spiritual truth, without the will of man. The fact that spiritual knowledge is not imparted to the human being against his will is only advantageous for him, for then he would not use it properly and his guilt would only increase because he would then leave a gift of grace unused. He would also get into a state which would be equal to the compulsion of faith, for knowledge would then force him to believe as soon as it is extraordinarily imparted to him, and a forced faith is worthless before God. Thus it inevitably takes the human being's own will for God to introduce him to truth, to spiritual knowledge which is intended to promote his higher development. Therefore the knowledge will only become effective in him when his will demands it. He can certainly also acquire it beforehand through external transmission, through the teaching of fellow human beings or through intellectual absorption from books and writings. But the will must also be involved. The desire for truth must dominate the human being, otherwise that good remains incomprehensible to him, thus it means no light for him. For if God imparted light to the human being without his desire, then the striving towards God would be prevented, but the human being would suddenly be placed into a state of realization, because divine wisdom, the knowledge which corresponds to truth, always signifies light for the human being. He would grasp everything, recognize the correlation of all things and all events, and he would now also increase his degree of maturity. Thus he would inevitably become a mature being, but this excludes becoming perfect, because perfection requires complete free will. As the human being is knowledgeable, he is also permeated by light, thus flooded by divine strength. Divine strength, however, can only be supplied to the beingness which consciously desires it and opens itself to the reception of strength. But the latter requires the will of man. If the will is not active, then also every supply of strength comes to a standstill, because God's radiation requires complete lack of resistance in order to become effective. But the human being is only then without resistance when he has placed his will completely under God's will, and that is a conscious becoming active of his will. Only then is an upward development possible, and only then will knowledge be felt by man as knowledge, as light and power from God. Therefore, knowledge cannot be imparted in a school, for even knowledge transferred from person to person presupposes the human being's activity of will if knowledge is to come alive in him. And therefore it is impossible to transfer the whole of humanity into a higher level of knowledge and thereby remedy the spiritual low, for this would happen against people's will and therefore would also not result in their perfection. And therefore truth, even if it is offered everywhere, will only assert itself sporadically, and that is where the will sets in the desire to possess it. Knowledge against the human being's will only contributes to making him arrogant and domineering, for it then only touches the intellect but not the human being's heart, but only where the heart and intellect are willing to let the knowledge take effect on them. That is also where the transformation, the change of the human being into a being according to God's will, begins. As long as the intellect alone processes knowledge, this is only a body of thought that is inanimate from the Spirit of God. It sets the activity of the intellect in motion and can also only be passed on again to the fellow human being's intellect. The human being's will is only involved insofar as he strives for knowledge for the sake of earthly advantage. He wants to be considered knowledgeable, to gain earthly goods and honor and glory with it and to outdo fellow human beings with his knowledge. And then the knowledge, even if it is offered to him from a source that vouches for pure truth, can never contribute to the ennoblement of the human being, for the heart remains uninvolved and the spirit in the human being does not stir, for it is unawakened, it still slumbers in deepest envelopment. Then the knowledge, despite its content, cannot be addressed as spiritual knowledge, because it was not imparted to him by the Spirit within himself, or he did not absorb with his spirit what was offered by the enlightened fellow human being. Mostly, however, the worldly-minded person will reject that spiritual knowledge because earthly success seems too small to him, but he still strives for such. The working of the Spirit can never be eliminated in the transmission of pure truth, of spiritual knowledge, and therefore the human being's will has to be active, otherwise the knowledge would be without strength and therefore of no significance for the human being's spiritual ascent. And therefore humanity walks in ignorance, and it cannot attain knowledge as long as it is not willing to possess and strive for it itself. For the will is the first thing that causes God's grace to flow to the human being. But if the will is willing, then the source of grace opens and a human being can constantly draw and take in the living water, the eternal truth. Amen.